in a world without war? Will there ever be sacrifice or a need for a sacrifice? It's kind of a sad thought, right? Because nobody wants war. Nobody likes the idea of war, but it's had positive influence despite its negative influences. And without war, we think we can still have those positive aspects.
I don't know. I don't think war is ever clean.
Hey guys, welcome to Right Reason. Today I've got a really interesting guest with me, Meschter. He's a friend of mine and someone that's written books on topics that I think are on the same subject as Right Reason's basic thesis. And I'd love to bring him on today and discuss really virtue ethic, military role in producing a virtue ethic. Historically, it's always been connected in an interesting way, within a free society. Having a military involvement in character formation has always resulted in an interesting symbiosis between, kind of like military activity, but also personal development. And that's not something I've had a lot of personal experience with, but he has, and I want to ask him about that. So, Drew, as you're writing this, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Let me jump right into it, right? So what's, for those who don't know you, what's been your experience with the military on various levels and just with formation and I guess military schools? Like, what's been your background in that?
Sure. So I was interested in the military as a kid, as a 9-year-old. And then as I grew up, I kind of realized the military, that war is not a glamorous thing, and I went through a period of really thinking that military service was something best avoided. But then I kind of went through a crisis when I was in my mid-20s, and I thought to myself that if I didn't become a soldier on some level, I wouldn't want to be an old man never having been in the military. So it became a thing that I just had to do. And this took place around 2004, right after the U.S. invaded Iraq. I did not agree with the Iraq invasion. I did not believe that we should be in the Middle East. But the fact that the U.S. government invaded a foreign country and the people in government who were approving that invasion, most of them had never served or had never been at war, really bothered me. Not to pick on Hillary Clinton, but, she was a war hawk at the time. And a lot of these people who had no skin in the game, their kids were not going to serve, they voted for us to invade a foreign country. So I thought to myself, in order to be a citizen in the way that the founding fathers were citizens, I had to be a citizen soldier. So my military idea was not to be a professional soldier. I'm not really cut out to be a Navy SEAL or anything like that. I'm not really all that gung-ho. I wanted to be a citizen soldier in the way that the ancient Athenians had been citizen soldiers, or the ancient Romans. So I joined a National Guard unit in Philadelphia that had a long history, founded in 1774, and I went through basic training at Fort Knox to become a cavalry scout. And then I deployed twice, once to Iraq in 2005 and once to Egypt in 2008. So I had to go through basic training as a normal soldier. I went in as a private, got trained to be what they call a trigger puller, a combat arms unit. But while this was all going on, I was also a civilian. So my experience was to be a citizen soldier in the National Guard.
So what education on the military angle have you gone through? So you've gone through boot camp.
Yeah. Yeah, so the interesting thing is that I had a master's degree in history when I joined. I was 27 years old. A lot of guys that join are like 17 or 18, so right. I had like a decade on them. And my academic path kind of had made me more academic, reading books, theorizing, and that's kind of more my frame of mind. Going into the Army at age 27 kind of deprogrammed me. Like you think of basic training as a way of programming soldiers, mm-hmm. but actually basic training deprogrammed my academic thinking, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. A lot of academic thinking is very much in an echo chamber of certain worldviews. an echo chamber of gender neutral. I guess we can kind of imagine what the academic environment is like now, or the way it was when I was there. U.S. Army basic training at Fort Knox in 2004 was kind of the opposite of that, and they deprogrammed me as an educated person and kind of turned me into a basic American. Like they kind of walk you through a way of unknowing what you think you know, so that you can then be built up as a soldier, as a part of a team. They de-emphasize being an individual, and like they actually tell you that you're not worth anything as an individual. You're only worth something when you can work with others. And it's a death to your own ego. It's a painful process, but it's designed. Millions of people do it. Thousands of people do it a year. It's choreographed to systematically unbuild you and then build you back up. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of what it's designed to do. And I'd be happy to share details about that if you have any specific questions.
Yeah, you broke out there for a second, or maybe that was my connection.
Oh, okay.
But in any case, so what I wanted to ask about all that is the virtue ethic that, yeah. And I want to ask you about history, the Athenians, the Romans, that stuff I love. I love to nerd out.
Oh, and the virtue was huge. Virtue training. So the U.S. military is a pragmatic organization, and over the past 30 years, morality in American households has gone down. And they basically had to take it upon themselves to teach right and wrong to kids who were not taught that at home. Mm. There's a lot of virtue, honesty, integrity, not stealing, treating others well. There's a lot of moral training in the military just because they're not getting it from home. So these kids have to be taught that.
And you think that was an intentional program, like among the upper brass, to make sure that that part does not get lost as the culture shifts away from it?
Yeah, I think that it was, so every 20 or 30 years, the U.S. military gets tested by a war. And when a war takes place, it forms a way of focusing attention by showing what works and what doesn't. It happens in Vietnam, at World War II. So the military is a learning organization that's constantly getting thrown into a fire, and the fire will purify what works and what doesn't. So I think that the moral compass just gets reproven every 30 years. And I'm sure that the top leadership thinks about it, but I think it's also just kind of like, it's institutional knowledge, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. So let me give you some pushback. I mean, I love all this, and I think that's tremendous. My opposite observation, which I have a lot of confirming observations of everything you've said. I have one contrary observation, which is that a lot of soldiers, I have some friends, personal friends, that have gone through the military and have gone like Marines, sniper, like recon, like serious people that would put a regular soldier to shame in their intensity.
Yeah.
There is a very strong ethic within the military context, but outside of it, right? In their relationships with women, with their families, that has not been a strong suit of the soldiers that I knew and I know personally. And they've told me that, like, they kind of, when they come out of that intense bubble of the military life, not only do they not know what to do with themselves personally, there's a lot of confusion and crisis on a personal level, like, what do I do now that I can't kill people for a living?
Yeah.
But just in how, like, the people that I know are very, they were very buff, very, very physically impressive, and they use that into becoming very loose in their personal life. To get attached and settle down was like impossible to them. So what do you think? How do you think the military virtue ethic converts into a human virtue ethic? Do you think they're the same thing, or is it a kind of a version of itself, of the larger thing that doesn't really convert into civilian life?
No, so I think there's a huge difference between a warrior and a citizen soldier. So a Marine So most Marines will go in at age 18 and get out at 23, and it's a life passage. They move on. But the ones who become specialized in a certain branch, like recon or I don't know how many actual snipers there are. Frankly, it's a joke that Marines always claim to have been snipers. But what you're describing, that's much different than what I experienced as a National Guard soldier. So it's kind of apples and you can't just say they're both military, but they're very, very different in what they do to a human being. So the National Guard, basically, you go through basic training for like 4 months, and then you'll deploy. But most of your life is as a civilian, so it doesn't disrupt you from civilian life in quite the same way.
So you think you go like all in on the military life? That's kind of what messes with your value structures a little bit.
Yeah, and I would. It's to say the term military life implies a monolithic culture that's obviously everyone in the military has in common that they're in the military, but the different jobs in the military can be like night and day. I mean, so I think it very much depends on what your specific job is and what you did in life. But and
I don't mean to imply that by any means that like what I said kind of like applies to every single person that has a military life. But I just was surprised by, at least among the professionals that I knew and know, I was surprised by these blind spots.
Oh, of course there's going to be blind spots.
But like really obvious ones, like more glaring than if they were just civilian,
Sure.
like pretty severe lapses in moral character, which is in contrast to the other piece that you represent really well, which is the very, very strong ethical push towards a high standard also in the military. So these two contrasts made me suspect that maybe what's happening is there's a pragmatic embrace of the military and not a principled embrace. And what I mean by that is you have a virtue ethic for the sake of creating better soldiers, not for the sake of creating better men. And so when the soldier part gets turned off, then the virtue ethic gets turned off in some way, at least for some people as well. What do you think?
Well, I think the big caveat is war itself. I mean, we think of World War II as like the greatest generation, but in 1945, when those guys were coming home, psychologists were like terrified that all these killers were going to get unleashed. Like now, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg like idolize these people because they're 90 years old.
Right.
When they were 21 and coming back from Tarawa, they were terrifying, and like they were alcoholics, and they were going crazy, and like. So you have to differentiate between war, which is chaos, and then military, which tries to create order amidst that. So they're almost opposites. The virtue training is trying to compensate for the amorality of war, which is the absence of morality.
So interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're talking to Marines who've been, I deployed in a combat situation, but I didn't do the kinds of things that I might have if I had been a SEAL or it just depends on what kind of wartime experiences you've had. And there's a huge difference between the kind of personality that excels in the chaos of the type of war war situation. But so anyway, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It really does. So kind of it's the war. It's not the military aspect. It's the war aspect that really messes with your value structures.
Yeah, you can almost say that, and this is going to sound weird, but you could almost say that the military is the opposite of war. The military exists to take what war is and then be a counterbalance to it. Right? So a pure state of war would be a pure state of chaos in which there's no order and in which it's a free-for-all.
That's really good, yeah.
So the military structures, which have been evolving for thousands of years, exist to counteract that chaos. And then to be able to dial it in. The Marines, for example, so the Army exists basically to be there during a total war conflict. The Marines usually are more engaged. They've been the arm of the State Department for over 150 years. And the Marines have been used to bring armed force to situations that Congress would not approve to be an actual war, right? So the Marines are trained to work in a spectrum of giving candy to kids to leveling a village if they have to. So they call it a spectrum of response. And soldiers are trained for the same thing. So, but all that stuff is just doctrinal theory until it actually takes place. And it's very rare that villages get leveled. It's probably very rare that soldiers are in there just to be giving chocolate bars. Although that didn't happen during the Haiti earthquake. The Marines went in and were giving out blankets,
Oh yeah, yeah, I think some of the vilification of the military, which can be seen sometimes, I don't think there's any basis for that in the classical philosophy, which is really kind of what I'm all about, what right reason is all about. So a lot of the questions which seem open to being disputed, like the morality of war as such, that's not really a debate within the classical worldview and right reason.
No.
So I have the idea of war itself is not inherently immoral in the classical thought. So,
No.
so obviously soldiers are not inherently evil as a profession, and obviously along with, God forbid, leveling a village, you have to give out candies to kids, like all that. That's part of war. That's part of what life is, and everything that's in life. So that's fine. But it's interesting. I loved how you mentioned that the idolized Greatest Generation really came back as kind of savages in a way that is hard to even realize today, because what they've seen is, it's when we say, you can't imagine what they've seen, right? And they've seen some horrible, horrific things. That's true, but that's more of a platitude that kind of covers up really what they have seen, which not only have they seen atrocities, and they maybe have done atrocities, but that's reflected on their character. That's left an imprint on the man.
This is very interesting because, okay, I mean, some of them probably came back as savages. A lot more of them came back as just, dealing with issues, right? When you look at this, at the genre of World War II movies and the year in which they were produced, movies that came out in 1945 were about amputees. They were about men trying to reclaim their senses. They were about marriages that were failing. By 1950, with the Korean War coming, they started to kind of tap into a heroism from World War II to kind of like resist the Soviets. By the mid-60s, the war movies were like jokes, like Kelly's Heroes. It was like kind of like Three-Ring Circus, kind of like fun stuff. So if you look at the history of Hollywood movies of World War II and the year they were made, that is a study unto itself to show the processing, the process, the psychological process of dealing with it.
I've kind of been shocked by how depressing the war movies have been from the black and white era. You'd think that that sort of deconstruction of war was a kind of a modern phenomenon, of more of like a 1960s, 70s, 80s thing, but even in the 50s and the 40s. So
I mean, it was fresh in everyone's mind. Actually, they've proven that there's a 15-year gap between when it happens and when people can start thinking about it. When I was a kid in the early 80s, all the heroes of the TV action movies were Vietnam vets. A-Team, Simon & Simon, Magnum P.I. That was 15 years after Vietnam. So it was only by the time I was a boy that Vietnam was safe enough of a distance to start making the vets heroes. In the mid-70s, those vets would have been deranged, whatever.
I mean, Rambo, for me, Rambo is the biggest example of the glorification of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and the glorification only happened about 15 years once it became safe to start wanting to rethink it. Now, I would push back at you about classical morality, and I would say that there's a huge difference between Christianity and ancient Greece. There is a brutality in the ancient Greek mindset that, women were considered less than second-class citizens. Slavery, the whole societies were based on slavery. And the Athenian thinkers who were sitting in the square of Athens debating about great themes, the reason they were able to sit around and talk was because they had slaves taking care of everything. So to use the word morality and the word classical is a little bit of a misnomer if you're thinking at it from the humanistic, the truly humanistic view that Christianity has given us of all people being created equal in the eyes of God?
Well, when I say classical, I don't mean 5th century BC. That's not, it's a comprehensive term. It really refers to the tradition.
Yeah.
That's kind of uniform in a very surprising way, because you don't really think of traditions as uniform. A lot of times ideas fall apart after a few decades, let alone a century.
Yeah.
This thing has survived for thousands of years. It does have roots in 5th century BC, but then it really becomes really amplified in the Roman era, which also had slaves, but had a very different and a more intensely purified, like a lot of the people that are in the classics world, as I was, they pick favorites. They love like a culture or a period that they just focus on. And so there is a kind of a tendency to love and extol the Greek,
well, there's a lot of beauty there.
No. Yeah, I get that. But so there's within the classics profession or field, there is a strong tendency to idealize the Greek foundations of the West and Athens and everything. And so, not only for the fact that they had slaves and they had other things that we today would not agree on, that's not even the main reason, or that's not the only reason to sort of not put them on a pedestal from my perspective. But even within the notion of democracy as a thing, their version of free society was not perfect from the perspective of, they fell to tyranny and demagogue. So their own democracy that they invented for the first time in history was imperfect within its own boundaries of what it's trying to do. And so the Romans perfected on it with the Republican concept. That's a whole different thing.
Oh, totally, yeah.
So when I say classical, I don't mean 5th century BC. I'm not a snob that's a Philhellene that puts the Greeks in a bubble, that puts them on a pedestal. I just want to say classical really refers to 500s BC up to 1900 AD. Like the classical worldview kind of begins to fray at the edges after
World War I.
And it begins to fray after the founding fathers were the first ones to say something's happening in Europe at the end of the 18th century, where they're stopping to learn Latin and Greek. They're not interested in that as much anymore, and it's going to have drastic consequences for civilization if we stop to understand and study those high points of values. With their own limitations, nevertheless, they were very high expressions. And so with Kant, Hegel, the 1800s, really there's a decline in interest in classical concepts. And World War I, the 20th century, really is the end of the classical impact in the West. And after 1900, it's Western civilization, but not the same, because it's untethered from its classical roots. So anyway, so that's sort of the suite that I'm dealing with. And within that 500 BC to 1900 AD, that's a remarkably uniform, like shockingly uniform.
Yeah, I agree.
Belief system and philosophy, ethics, and all these things. So like the just war theory, which does.
Right here too. I mean, that's the reason I'm against our invasion.
Yeah. I mean, it's very much a Christian Renaissance and medieval theory of war, but it does have roots in ancient Rome. It just
when Caesar crossed the
Rubicon. Yeah, but let me ask you about that sort of the civic, like citizen soldier ideal, and this ideal that becomes really born in Greece, and then I think it gets like 10x in Rome, which is like so intense in ancient books about ancient Rome. Mm-hmm. This ideal of the citizen soldier, which you tried to follow in your life.
Oh yeah, I still adhere to it.
Question. So do you what do you think about that on a practical level? Like, would you have all of America's boys go through military school, or do you think that's too extreme? Like, what is your sense of its practical applicability to engender the same virtue ethic that, at least within the short practice of military, not to go to war and be scarred by that, but within sort of the bounds that military can give you and training that it gives you, it does seem to have a value that's unique in our culture.
Okay, so when the U.S., when not even the U.S., when America was settled in the 17th century, in most of the colonies up and down the East Coast, all able-bodied males had to serve in the militias, period. Everyone did. Up through the 18th century, it was the norm. I mean, the reason the First City Troop, my unit in Philadelphia, a lot of guys served in the militia back then. The troop was the militia for businessmen. But so to answer your question, we have an historical precedent for required service. I can't imagine it being national.
So let me back up. I don't mean to advocate for the draft or for the
let me finish my thought real quick. Do you mind? So I lived in Germany briefly, and that's what inspired me to join. Back in the early 2000s, German men, all males, had to serve for 1 year in the army or helping old people at retirement homes. And I loved what it did to the people. It gave them character. And I think that doing it at the state level, possibly, like if Pennsylvania had a pilot program offering it, I don't know about requiring it. I guess maybe I'm not sure. I don't know.
So yeah, not on the like policy level, not on the government level, really on a personal level, like and not in the sense of enrolling in the military. That's like a different question of the draft and national service. That's like the next level. I'm not really. What I really mean is, a high school that's like a military school versus like a public high school. They could not be more unrelated to each other in every way. So would you, like, with your family, with my 2.5-year-old son, would you want to send him to a military high school? Kind of is my question. Have him like march up and down parade grounds, have him with a uniform on, have him to start to imbibe the military ethic, which is kind of a version of the virtue ethic. Or do you think that's like an extreme step and you can get those values somewhere else?
Actually, I mean, I do not think you can get them anywhere else. I think they have to be trained that way. I really do.
I think the Boy Scouts were a version of that.
Oh yeah, that's what made them so compelling back when they were actually popular. I mean, I think the degree to which the Boy Scouts I don't want to say demilitarized, but it was shocking. It was shocking to me when I went to basic training and I stood in formation and did this stuff, how much it reminded me of Boy Scout camp as a kid. In a good way, in a fun way.
You called the Boy Scouts in the 80s when they were still sort of a little militarized.
Yeah, I joined in 1989. So like in the early 90s is when I was in the Boy Scouts. And there was it wasn't militaristic really, but we wore uniforms. We had the stand-in formation in the beginning and stuff like that. There was a lot of situational male humor, which it's very weird. I guess a tangent. I won't go there unless you want. But humor is a huge factor of military life. Let me tell you, that's the most compelling one. And actually, I will mention it right now. So this is going to sound like paradoxical, but the more orderly and the more disciplined the environment, the funnier things get. Because the more people screw up, the more rules there are to follow. The more humans screw up and don't follow them right, the more opportunity for just hilarious, funny situations. I know that sounds weird, but one of the most compelling things that most veterans will remember is just the laughs.
Yeah, no, I get it. That sort of intuitively makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess like stress also creates humor. Like stress, you have like gallows humor a lot of times. Oh, you have to do
hierarchy creates humor.
Huh?
It's really weird though. The higher up a person is in a hierarchy, the more serious you expect them to be.
Yeah.
The funnier it is when they break their role and make something funny. It just busts everyone up. It's a weird thing about human nature.
Yeah. So you can't get those values anywhere else, and you could in a way back in the day get them through the Boy Scouts, like in a much more diluted form, but like at 12, 15, that's what they were there for, is to instill that. So it sounds like even for those age groups, for like 100 years, it was deemed valuable to provide that sort of structured life to young men, even as far back as the 1950s, 1930s, 1910s.
Yeah. Okay. Now this is interesting because one of my favorite books ever is Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which I've read and reread. I mean, on nerd levels of like saturation, I've absorbed this book. And even though American males tended to be in militias, they were not very militaristic. The tradition in the U.S. is for completely indisciplined farmhands
Right.
to rally during an emergency and fight professionals and basically make a lot of mistakes while doing it. So even though I do think there are lessons that can be learned from military training in its strict kind of Prussian sense, I also think that there's something very American about having no exposure to that.
Yeah, but then you need that virtue ethic somewhere else, from somewhere else.
Which has to come from the church.
The church, the family, the media, the culture, really. Yes.
Yeah.
So, like, you would recommend a military high school?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's very weird. When I lived in Europe, I noticed that Europeans get sent to boarding schools. Americans, even you have to be rich enough to go afford one, but Americans usually, the parents ask the kid if they want to go. Maybe military schools they'll get sent if their behavior problem.
I don't think boarding schools are exactly an equivalent to a military school. Like,
they used to be.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Read my book about. I don't mean to plug it, but the gentleman kind of thing of the British elite boarding schools were heavily, if not militaristic, very extremely disciplined in a military equivalent.
Why don't you? I want you to take a second and plug your book a little bit. Like what is it called and what's in it? What do you talk about?
Okay, so the book is called The Gentleman of Gloucester, and no, that's in the book. Sorry, that was about my unit. This book is called As Iron Sharpens Iron, and it's a history of the idea of the gentleman as I kind of learned it during my own life. And there are sections that describe how British boarding schools trained this idea in the 19th century. And then it describes how when I was in the military, I kind of got my own version of what I thought was the British boarding school experience through the military. So I guess to your point, when the British Empire was expanding, they needed someone to run it. And they basically started training the most elite young men to be soldierly, to toughen them up, to teach teamwork and stuff like that. And they went back to a classical ideal to do it, kind of based on the Spartans and the Romans and, Plato's Republic, where he talks about guardians who are, who kind of run society and stuff like that. So there was a lot of classical thinking built into it. But there was a military, the games of rugby, rowing, these were invented to kind of channel male energy into an organized format that was aggressive but orderly.
Is that Matthew Arnold's?
Oh, yeah.
Is that his thing?
Oh, yeah. Matthew Arnold, might be Thomas Arnold.
Yeah, Thomas Arnold.
Thomas Arnold.
I think they're brothers. So let me ask you about that. But I actually was interested in sort of the British boarding school culture a little bit myself. So before the Arnold, the school reformer that we talk about, I think he's in the early 1800s, 1840s, somewhere there. Before him, that culture didn't exist in like Eton and Harrow and other English boarding schools, like the Boy Scout culture.
Yeah, so basically, when he came along in the 1840s or 30s, after a Christian revival that swept through the English-speaking world, we call it the Second Great Awakening. It happened in England as well. And there was a cultural Christianization that took place around that time. And British society, up until then, had been very morally lax. Like in the Jane Austen period, if you think of it as prim and proper, it was actually pretty bawdy. And the British boarding schools at that time were very laissez-faire, not very many rules, lots of bullying, just very, just like lawless. And a lot of educational thinkers saw the situation and realized that boys were just getting led astray as a result. Thomas Arnold instituted a bunch of reforms at rugby that Christianized things. They wanted the boys to become more Christian, but he also introduced organized sports as a way of taking their aggression and channeling it. And a lot of the sports that we use in the modern world were done by the British upper class at that time to codify and just channel physical energy and to get people physically fit while morally training them.
So before Arnold, the sort of the boarding school culture was not at all what we think of it today, or maybe a small version of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too sweeping about it, but it was. I don't know if I can answer that accurately, so I won't.
I've been interested in the British Empire as a thing, and so they began sort of the soldier ethic, as it were, that sort of characterized the British military, which at its peak was a very interesting cultural phenomenon of its own, right? And they had that even before Thomas Arnold. So like the redcoats that we think of in America as like these like really nefarious, scary soldiers that we barely managed to defeat. I mean, but from the British perspective, these were badass, like really like manly men, and so
very elite. So in England, so the British Empire was created by the Royal Navy. So the first British Empire was created around the time of Queen Elizabeth, with basically pirates who attacked Spanish ships and attacked Spanish places. So the British Empire kind of expanded through maritime exploits. Then, and that's actually how Rome expanded too. So they expanded through business and maritime, and then later soldiers were brought in to kind of keep order. In England, the soldiers tended to be drawn from the most upper class and the most lower class. So the ruffians and very lower class people became soldiers on the enlisted ranks. Aristocrats and very rich people became officers. And the elite British sporting schools always produced good officers. So Eton, they produced like the officers leading the British Army. And there was definitely a class element there where the upper class gravitated toward the army, and then the upper middle class gravitated toward the Navy in England.
So even before Arnold reforms in schools, they had a kind of a virtue ethic culture in the military.
Oh, totally. And also just from they would have.
Kind of made it more mainstream, I guess. He made it like everybody now became involved in it.
He did, because what the boarding schools did before the Industrial Revolution, the people who went to these schools tended to be aristocrats or landed gentry. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, people started making money in manufacturing and started forming a new middle class. The boarding schools invited them in, but they tried to put an aristocratic stamp on them to kind of make them gentrified. And Arnold was very much a part of that process.
Mm. So there's a suite that, if we think of a warrior ethic sort of in modern sort of English/American context, I guess there's a kind of an aristocratic element, which doesn't really find a lot of resonance in lower classes of society at like in the 1700s. Then in the 1800s, Thomas Arnold comes in and he reforms schools, and it becomes a lot more like upper and middle classes now are part of sort of virtue ethic.
And the idea of the gentleman is a blending. The idea of the gentleman, as it developed, was a blending of the upper and middle class. So the British upper class was always military. When Norman the Conqueror came and took over England, he was a soldier. The aristocracy was always a military aristocracy, always. They looked down on business as beneath them.
Right.
Like in America, we think of business as being the people that run things, and the soldiers are the ones that do what the business people want.
Right.
England was the opposite. The soldiers ran everything. That was the elite. That was the aristocracy. Business people were looked down on, but in the 18th century, they started getting so much money and power that they tried to kind of blend the two together. So the military virtues were always part of the British boarding school system. They were always part of the British gentlemanly idea. When Castiglione wrote the Book of the Courtier in the Renaissance that described it was like the Renaissance man idea of a gentleman. He was a soldier. He painted pictures, he played on the flute, and he was like, he could talk with ladies and stuff, but he also was in Renaissance Italy. His main occupation was going out and putting on armor.
And I'm going to end with this question. This has really been, I think it's a perfect follow-up to Castiglione and the history of sort of war making as a civilized, gentrified activity that's both become demonized in a lot of ways in today's culture, but also has been cleaner in actual history than we kind of think of it, it was a lot more clean and ennobling than we realize today, right? So there was like a very positive aspect to it, and we discussed today the virtue ethic of it as well. But what I really want to know is, and putting aside the question of today's culture and where else you can get virtue without that machine, the factory of character that we call the military, putting that aside and putting aside the vacuum of values without that, in principle, in the abstract, if it is the case that war in a clean version of it does have kind of a positive sort of personal effect on some people, in the absence of war, complete absence of any war, do you think that obviously people's lives will be saved, so there's a positive aspect, but is there a negative aspect in the absence of trials and the absence of ultimate sacrifice in anyone's lived experience? Like, you'll never have met anyone, I would have never known anyone. It would have just be a completely strange idea to go and not only kill somebody, which why would you ever want to do that, but the idea of being killed for any reason at all would seem completely strange to anyone. And so do you think war, along with the negatives, has had a positive influence, which in the era of nuclear weapons, war is becoming more and more a thing of the past because it's not going to be waged anymore. So if war is banished.
Yeah, but actually, nuclear weapons, well, I don't want to go down that. I would actually go and say, so nuclear weapons might make total war less common, but dude, war is so much a part of the human condition. It's like trying to imagine a world without gravity. Like, this is my pen. The pen just dropped because of gravity.
Yeah, but like right now, there's like tension between China and India. I mean, there is tension between China and India. There's a kind of a small scale conflict right now. Skirmishes. There's a lot of tension right now, right? And it might be small scale here and there, but we all understand that they're not going to ever become in actual all out war with each other.
Oh,
because if they do go it's us or them, then they will nuke each other, which means the whole world is nuked, which means end of life as we know it. So we all understand that they will actually go into full all out war with each other. And because we can't let the fullness of it become realized, we all understand that's not going to end well for the planet. And that's just now. Imagine 100 years from now, where it's like nukes on every street corner. So that ultimate threat, the sword of Damocles, hanging on above our heads at every single second, this nuclear deterrent means that war as such itself is going to be a thing of the past.
Yeah, that's, James, forgive me, but that's very naive.
No, please tell me.
That's extremely naive.
I mean, what if gangs get nuclear weapons 100 years from little nuclear suitcases?
You're attributing a level of reason and restraint to world actors that is completely
right.
No,
they may not be restrained, and they may actually nuke all of us, and that's a different conversation. What happens to a post-nuclear world? I'm just saying.
For you to say that there won't be any war in the future is like for me to say that my pen will levitate up and the gravity will not affect my pen.
All I'm saying is, here, let's entertain the hypothetical, not even a real scenario. In a hypothetical world, if there is such a scare of something truly apocalyptic happening because of very easily accessible, hyper-destructive forces that can be unleashed very easily and very cheaply, if in that hypothetical scenario, world actors will never actually go all out to across that edge, which will become too terrifying to engage in. So they will pull back. If there is, for the last 50 years, there hasn't really been a war. Really, on a big war. A total war. And as the world gets smaller, it's going to be less and less viable without. Anyway, so in the hypothetical world, if there is a decline in military engagements, if military becomes a lot more bloody and deadly, a lot less noble and clean in a way that it was clean before, what's, will society, basically the civilization exist? Do virtue ethics, does the military ethic, does the character formation of men, can that survive in a world with no conflict of any kind? Or do we need this, the civilization need war to bring men into conflict with reality, to bring men into a context of self-sacrifice every few generations, so that we are reminded, we're put into context of ultimate sacrifice, of a choice of killing somebody for a reason, doing it or not doing it. That's sort of such a raw place to be at. And if we ever get away from that, does a strong motivator for heavy ethical thinking disappear as well? And we just become kind of, our minds begin to live in a padded world where nothing we do really matters that much, and no one's going to ask really that much of us ever after. In a world without war, will there ever be sacrifice or a need for a sacrifice? It's kind of a sad thought, right? Because nobody wants war, nobody likes the idea of war, but it's had positive influence despite its negative influences. And without war, we think we can still have those positive aspects.
I don't know. I don't think war is ever clean.
Well, you know what I mean by clean. You know what I mean. Obviously, it's not clean, but it's got, at least back in, this is like one of the reasons why a lot of the, when mechanized warfare became a thing in the in World War II, basically, right? A lot of the old soldiers were very depressed by that, because they thought that the idea of courage became obsolete, because the tank and artillery and drones and everything made it such that personal courage was basically optional. And so now we're 100 years beyond that. Now personal courage is not even relevant. It's just, can you sit behind a computer and drive a drone to kill someone from 1,000 miles away? That's my question. Like, we're moving into a world where sort of the old warrior ethic is no longer practical, or getting less and less practical. Do you think that's something we have to observe and be concerned about, or do you think it's not an issue?
I don't think it's an issue, because I don't think it's controllable.
We have to find other ways to make up for that. Like, if we can't in the future, no one's going to ask us to die or kill or something.
It's not controllable. I have a friend who lives on Walnut Street, whose next door building was burned 2-3 months ago during the riots in Philadelphia. Physical eruptions are normal in human events.
But we don't have like
the riots that took place, whether you agree with them or don't. Like people took it upon themselves to use physical force to demonstrate what they want or don't want. They broke windows, they burned buildings in your town where you are right now. So to even imply that this is going away is a bit insane, because the physical option is there. It's going on right now in Portland. Physical force, war is the realm of physical force.
I think we have a difference there, because I don't see the culture, the military culture, living on. Like, yeah, we'll have assault and theft and riots and like police action, but unless you and I join the police or we join the riots, we're not going to be involved in that physical culture, and so we don't extract the values from whatever.
I don't know, my friends living on Walnut Street were involved in the physical culture by walking out of their buildings. Yeah,
I mean, there's going to be instances, but I think it's an open question that I think, for me at least, it's something that I think about in any case.
Hey, I'm not trying to shoot down your question.
No, I get it. I just think it's something I think of a lot about is this has been for thousands of years a negative and a positive in lives of men. A lot of the poets and the historians have noticed the positivity, with the negativity, the positivity of war in character and et cetera, et cetera. And now with the mechanization of war, and now with the nuclear deterrent of any war, there's concern about that. In any case, we're going on the hour.
Yeah.
I think we've been talking for a good hour. I think this is a great time to pause. Your book is on Amazon. What is it called again?
As Iron Sharpens Iron.
Fantastic. It's all about this culture of being a gentleman, where it comes from, how it was made. People can read more about that later.
Yeah, and it does deal with these military ideas, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for listening, and thanks to Drew for coming on.
Yeah, and thank you, James. I treasure your thinking and the way you your intellectual honesty. I really appreciate it.